When you think about the connection you had with this person, it's almost impossible to explain it in simple terms. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't the kind of love that demanded attention. It was quieter than that, deeper than that. It felt like something that existed under the surface, like an energy, a pull, a recognition, almost as if your soul knew something long before your mind caught up. And that's the part most people misunderstand. They think an avoidant runs because they don't care, but the truth is much more complex, much more emotional, and far more intimate than anyone on the outside would ever believe. The truth is that an avoidant doesn't run from you. They run from the intensity of what they feel for you. They're not overwhelmed by attention. They're overwhelmed by the possibility of losing something that feels like it speaks directly to their soul. They don't love casually. They don't love easily. They don't love often. For someone like this, genuine connection is rare, so rare that it almost feels dangerous to them. And when they meet someone whose presence calms them, whose voice grounds them, whose energy feels familiar in a way they can't logically explain, their entire internal system goes into confusion. Because for them, love was never something gentle. Love was something that required caution, walls and distance. But you didn't come in through the door. You came in through their soul. You didn't chase them. You didn't pressure them. You didn't demand anything. You simply existed in a way that made them feel safe and seen, even when they weren't ready to admit it. And that's why your attention was never the thing that hooked them. In fact, your attention scared them at times. What pulled them toward you was your presence, your essence, your emotional depth. They didn't fall for your compliments or the way you showed up. They fell for the way you felt, the way conversations with you didn't feel transactional, the way silence with you wasn't awkward, the way your energy didn't demand anything from them except authenticity. It was your soul that reached them, not your attention. And that kind of connection is something an avoidant can feel long before they consciously understand it. This is what people never see. They see the withdrawal. They see the distance. They see the overthinking. They see the push and pull. But they don't see the internal storm happening inside the avoidant. They don't see how their heart reacts when they sense someone who feels different, someone who listens differently, someone who touches something inside them that they've spent years trying to protect. They feel the bond, but they also feel the fear. They want to get closer, but they worry about what closeness might bring. And this emotional conflict becomes their battle, not with you but with themselves, because at their core avoidants long for connection. They just learn to survive without it. So when they feel a soul-level bond, it shakes everything they know. They don't know whether to trust it or retreat from it. They don't know whether to lean in or run. And you probably saw this happening in real time. One moment they were warm, open, present, showing a level of emotional availability you thought they didn't even have. And then suddenly they pulled back. Suddenly they became distant. Suddenly they seemed confused. But this wasn't because the connection died. It was because the connection got too real. Internally, they were studying you in ways you never noticed. Not in a superficial way, but in a deeply emotional one. They were watching how you handle stress, how you respond to them when they're silent, how you react when they need space, how you treat them when they're not performing. They were noticing the softness in your voice when they opened up about something small. They were observing the way you stayed consistent, even when they weren't giving you much to work with. They were watching your reactions, your emotional tone, your patience. To them, these details mattered more than anything you ever said out loud. And the more they watched, the more they felt something they didn't have a name for. Something warm, something grounding, something familiar. The kind of familiarity that doesn't come from time, but from resonance, from alignment, from something spiritual, even if neither of you ever said it out loud. And that's why they kept coming back. Not because they needed attention, not because they felt lonely, not because they wanted validation, but because your soul felt like home in a way they didn't know how to process. Inside, they were experiencing a kind of emotional recognition they had no roadmap for, and you might have noticed it in the small moments, the fleeting glances that lingered longer than they should have, the pauses in their voice when they were searching for words, the softness in their eyes that appeared only when they looked at you. These were not accidents, these were not coincidences, these were signs of someone who felt more than they were ready to express. But with avoidance, this intensity doesn't create openness, it creates fear. Not fear of you, but fear of what losing you would do to them, fear of relying on someone, fear of being seen too deeply, fear of being known too intimately, fear of being loved in a way they never experienced before. And when emotions reach that level, their instinct is to withdraw, not to punish you, but to protect themselves from feeling something they can't control. The distance wasn't a rejection. It was a coping mechanism. It was them trying to manage a feeling that was bigger than their emotional capacity. You may have taken their silence personally, but inside, they were overwhelmed by the magnitude of what you triggered inside them. They weren't ignoring you, they were trying to breathe, trying to regulate, trying to understand why their heart responded to you in a way it has never responded to anyone else. And when they withdrew, it wasn't because they didn't care, it was because they cared too much, because caring meant vulnerability. And vulnerability meant danger to someone who learned to survive by not needing anyone. But even in their distance, they were still connected to you, thinking about you, feeling for you, missing you in a way that felt uncomfortable to them, because it wasn't about missing attention, it was about missing the emotional clarity you brought into their life. Their return wasn't random, it wasn't impulsive, it wasn't convenience, it was the result of them sitting with the absence of your presence and realizing that something inside them felt incomplete without it. Avoidants don't return to people who simply gave them attention. They return to people who touched their soul, and you did, more than you realized. This is the part most people never understand. An avoidant is more spiritually sensitive than they look. They may appear detached, logical, reserved, guarded, but deep inside they feel connection in a profound way. They just don't know how to express it, because expression requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust, and trust is something they give slowly and rarely. But with you, something inside them started to shift. They didn't feel judged. They didn't feel pressured. They didn't feel manipulated. For the first time in a long time, they felt emotionally safe, and that safety didn't come from your words. It came from your soul, from the calmness you carry, from the empathy you've shown, from the energy you hold. They felt it, even if they never said it, especially if they never said it. And that's why they paid attention to your smallest details, the way you looked at them when you thought they weren't noticing. The softness in your laugh, the sincerity in your advice, the patience in your tone, the steadiness in your presence. These weren't things they could ignore. These were things that reached them, softened them, challenged them. These were things that made them feel understood in a way they didn't know they craved. And the more they watched you, the more they realized something they weren't ready to admit. They didn't just like you, they connected with you. Not to your appearance, not to your attention, but to something deeper, something that felt ancient, something that felt like recognition. And that kind of bond is rare, rare enough to terrify them, rare enough to heal them, rare enough to wake something up inside them that had been dormant for years. You might think they didn't feel all of this because they didn't express it, but avoidance is not lack of emotion, it's difficulty managing emotion. Their silence wasn't emptiness, it was intensity. Their distance wasn't disinterest, it was vulnerability. Their hesitation wasn't rejection, it was fear of losing someone who touched them in a way they couldn't explain. And if you ever wondered why they kept studying you quietly, the answer is simple. They wanted to make sure that what they felt was real, that this connection wasn't a trick, that this safety wasn't temporary, that your soul could truly hold theirs without harming it. They were looking for proof, not that you loved them, but that they were finally safe enough to love you back. This is the proof that this avoidant loved your soul, not your attention, not your validation, not your effort, your soul. The one thing they never expected to find, and the one thing they never wanted to lose. When an avoidant feels something that reaches their soul, they don't just feel it in the moment. You become a presence inside their mind long after you're gone. They replay your words. They revisit the way you looked at them. They think about the tone you used when you spoke to them with kindness they weren't used to receiving. They remember the moments you listened without judgment, the moments you didn't rush them, the moments you stayed soft even when they were rough around the edges. Even in silence, you stayed with them, not because they wanted attention, but because something about you touched a part of them they believed would always stay numb. That impact doesn't fade. It lingers, it grows, it shifts things inside them they didn't know how to name. And the truth is, avoidants notice everything, especially the things they pretend they're ignoring. They have a heightened sensitivity to emotional shifts, to tone, to energy. They sense your moods, they feel when your heart is open and when it's guarded. They notice the subtle changes in your expressions, the warmth in your eyes, the sincerity in your voice. They watch you with a depth you rarely see because they do it quietly. They don't stare, they observe. They don't question, they study. They don't interrogate, they absorb. You became someone they couldn't help but notice, someone whose presence triggered something real inside them. And even though they acted detached at times, their feelings were growing in the shadows of their silence. They found themselves doing something they rarely do, letting pieces of their inner world slip through the cracks. Maybe it came out in a small story they didn't plan to share. Maybe it came in a moment where they said something vulnerable and then immediately pulled back. Maybe it came in the way their expression softened when they talked about something meaningful. These tiny confessions were not random, they were proof. Proof that they trusted you more than they trusted themselves. Proof that your soul felt safe enough for them to take emotional risks. Proof that they felt understood in a way that made them want to open up, even if only a little at a time. They didn't give you their whole heart at once. They gave you fragments, little windows into the world they usually guard. And each fragment was a sign of love far deeper than anything they verbally expressed. But with avoidance, vulnerability is always followed by internal chaos. The moment they reveal something personal, their mind goes into self-protection mode. They replay the conversation, they worry they shared too much, they wonder if you'll see them differently now. They fear that their openness will lead to expectations they can't meet, and so they retreat. They withdraw not because they regret trusting you, but because trust feels dangerous. They fear the weight of being seen too clearly. They fear needing someone. They fear relying on someone who could walk away. And yet, despite that fear, the connection they feel for you keeps pulling them back. Their pull-away moments were never about lack of care. They were never about losing interest. They were moments where their emotions exceeded their capacity to manage them. Imagine a person standing in front of a door that leads to everything they've ever wanted: connection, safety, intimacy, recognition, and instead of opening it, they freeze, not because the room is dangerous, but because they've never known what to do with something so genuine. That's what happened with you. They felt something soulful, something grounding, something rare, and instead of stepping toward it, they hesitated, not because they didn't feel it, but because they felt it too intensely. When they pulled away, they were battling themselves. They were trying to regulate emotions their heart felt deeply, but their mind didn't know how to handle. They were trying to convince themselves that distance would protect them from the vulnerability you brought out in them. They weren't trying to punish you, they were trying to find their footing. They needed space to process feelings that arrived too quickly and too powerfully. Space to understand why you mattered more than they expected. Space to make sense of the way your soul felt familiar in a world where everything else felt distant. And while they were creating that space, you stayed in their thoughts more than they will ever admit. You became the quiet comfort they turned to mentally, even when they physically stepped back. They remembered your patience, your softness, your emotional intelligence. They remembered how you never forced anything, never pressured them, never demanded immediate closeness. And that memory grounded them. It became the anchor they returned to when the fear subsided. And that is why they always came back, not for attention, but for the connection that made them feel something beyond survival mode. Avoidants do not return to people who simply made them feel wanted. They return to people who made them feel understood. People whose presence offered peace instead of pressure. People whose soul matched the softness they hide deep inside. You were that person. That's why they couldn't stay away for long. The bond wasn't something they could easily break, even if their fear tried to convince them they should. And a big part of their internal struggle came from something they never told you. They were testing you, even if they didn't realize it consciously. Avoidants create emotional tests without meaning to. They watch how you react when they pull back. They observe whether you become angry, clingy, or desperate. They notice whether you can hold space without forcing conversation. These tests are not manipulative, they are survival mechanisms. They need to know if you'll stay steady when they feel unstable. They need to know if your patience is real or conditional. They need to know if you can hold connection without suffocating them. They need to know if you can love them, even when their fear gets messy. And you pass those tests in ways you might not even realize. You didn't punish them for needing space. You didn't guilt them for needing time. You didn't demand explanations they weren't ready to give. Instead, you stayed emotionally consistent in a way that felt foreign and comforting at the same time. That consistency allowed them to slowly dismantle the belief that closeness leads to danger. It allowed them to see you as someone who wouldn't weaponize their vulnerability. It allowed them to feel safe enough to return, even after retreating. And every time they came back, it wasn't because they wanted attention. It was because their soul missed the safety you brought into their life. Their love shows up in ways that are easy to overlook if you're expecting grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Avoidants don't love loudly, they love quietly, consistently and deeply. They show love in the way they listen when you talk about things that matter to you, in the way they remember small details even when they pretend they weren't paying attention, in the way they soften around you in ways they don't around anyone else. Their love becomes visible in their presence, not their words. They show it in the comfort they feel sitting in silence with you. They show it in the subtle ways their body relaxes around you. They show it in the rare moments they let their guard down and allow you to see the gentle person hidden behind all the layers of fear and self-protection. And the truth is, their vulnerability with you is the biggest proof of all. When they opened up, whether it was sharing a story, expressing a feeling, or admitting something uncomfortable, they were giving you a part of themselves they don't give freely. Vulnerability for them is not casual, it's a sacred offering. It means trust, it means safety, it means care, it means they see you as someone who won't misuse their honesty. And even if those vulnerable moments were small, they were filled with emotional significance. They were signs of someone who felt connected to you on a deeper level than they could articulate. They loved your soul because it's the only thing that ever made them feel understood without needing to perform or pretend. Your energy made them feel seen in a way that didn't require effort. Your presence felt like something they didn't have to earn. Your empathy felt like a place where their wounds didn't make them unlovable. And even though they struggled to show it clearly, your soul gave them a sense of peace they've spent their entire life searching for. So when they pulled back, it wasn't because they were indifferent. It was because they were overwhelmed by the magnitude of what you represented. And when they returned, it wasn't because they needed attention. It was because they couldn't stay away from the connection that made them feel alive in a way nothing else did. They were drawn to your kindness, your patience, your emotional steadiness. They were drawn to the safety you unknowingly created. They were drawn to the way your soul felt like it recognized theirs. They were drawn to you not because you filled a void, but because you awakened something inside them. Their love wasn't loud, but it was real. It wasn't simple, but it was deep. It wasn't expressed perfectly, but it was sincere. And everything they did, every retreat, every return, every quiet observation, every hesitant confession, was proof that they loved your soul in a way they never expected to love anyone. You may not realize it, but the way you showed love became the language they understood better than any words they were ever given. You didn't force connection, you didn't hurry their heart, and you didn't demand emotional performances from them. Instead, you moved with gentleness, patience, and sincerity. And even though avoidants rarely say it out loud, that kind of emotional calm is what reaches them more than anything. It is through presence that they feel love, not through speeches or declarations. They watch how you sit with them, how you listen, how you breathe, how you make space for them without drowning them. They don't need loud reassurance, they need quiet stability. And you provided that in ways you didn't even know mattered. When they were around you, something in their body softened. You might have seen it in the way their shoulders relaxed, in the way their breathing steadied, in the way their eyes softened when they looked at you. The body never lies, even when the mouth does. And the truth is, your presence felt like warmth to someone who spent years living emotionally cold. They didn't know how to explain that being near you felt like peace. They weren't used to. They didn't know how to admit that your presence alone made them feel safer than most people ever have. But they felt it. It was real, it was grounding, and it was the kind of proof no words were ever needed for. And because of that, their love showed up through presence, not through performance. They may not have said "I love you" often, they may not have expressed emotions with fluency, but they were there in the ways they could be. You saw it in the moments they sat with you a little longer than they needed to, in the way they stayed close enough to feel you without making it obvious, in the way they listened when you talked about things that mattered to you. They paid attention without needing the spotlight. They cared without needing to show it dramatically. Their love was quiet but intentional, subtle but powerful, and you felt it, even if you weren't always sure how to interpret it. But the deepest proof of all came from their vulnerable moments, those rare instances where something inside them cracked open. Vulnerability for an avoidant is not natural. It is terrifying. It is foreign. It is something they've been conditioned to hide at all costs. And yet, with you, there were moments where they let their guard slip, moments where they shared something from their past that still hurt, moments where they admitted uncertainty, insecurity, or fear, moments where their voice softened and their eyes betrayed emotions they didn't have the courage to name, moments where they let you see the fragile parts of them that they protect from the world. What you didn't know was that every vulnerable moment was a gift, one they carefully chose to give you. They didn't open up because they were comfortable. They opened up because your soul made them feel safe. They didn't reveal things because they wanted sympathy. They revealed them because they trusted you enough to hold parts of them they had never shared with anyone else. Vulnerability was their love letter, even if it came out in fragments, hesitations, and half-hearted confessions. And even though those moments were brief, they were enormous in meaning. For someone who has spent their whole life hiding, offering even a glimpse of their inner world is a sign of deep affection. It's a sign that you matter. It's a sign that your presence disarmed their fear. It's a sign that they felt something real, something soulful, something that bypassed their defenses entirely. But whenever they got too close, whenever they let themselves feel too deeply, a quiet panic would rise inside them. The more they cared, the more afraid they became. Not afraid of you, afraid of the vulnerability caring required, afraid of being hurt, afraid of needing someone, afraid of depending on a connection they couldn't control. And this fear didn't show up as tears or vulnerability, it showed up as distance, as silence, as retreat, as that familiar avoidance pattern resurfacing the moment they felt themselves falling deeper than they intended to. And that's when their mixed signals began. The warm moments followed by cold ones, the closeness followed by distance, the affection followed by withdrawal. To anyone else, this would look inconsistent or confusing, but to someone who understands avoidant behavior, these mixed signals aren't mixed at all. They're deep signals. They reveal the push and pull between their heart and their fear. Their heart pulls them toward you because the connection feels safe, meaningful, and real. But their fear pushes them away because the connection feels powerful, unpredictable, and emotionally demanding. So they're stuck between wanting you and protecting themselves from you, between craving closeness and fearing what closeness might cost them. Every mixed signal was a reflection of internal conflict. When they got close, they realized how much they wanted you. When they pulled away, they were trying to regain control of their emotions. When they returned, it was because their heart missed the way your soul made them feel. They weren't toying with you. They weren't manipulating you. They weren't confused about you. They were confused about themselves. They were navigating emotions they had never learned how to handle, and you became the mirror reflecting all the things they tried to hide. And yet, despite their fear, despite their distance, they cared about your peace more than they cared about your attention. This is something most people overlook. Attention is easy to give, peace is not. But avoidants value peace in a partner because peace is the one thing they have never known how to create for themselves. They noticed how you protected their emotional space. They noticed how you didn't overwhelm them. They noticed how you allowed them to breathe. They appreciated the way you spoke gently, the way you approached conversations with sensitivity, the way you didn't push them into emotional corners. To them, that meant more than affection. It meant safety. They loved the fact that you gave them space without punishment. They loved that you respected their silence. They loved that you could remain grounded even when they were struggling internally. They loved that you didn't turn their hesitation into a battlefield. You became the one person who didn't make them feel defective for needing space. You became the one person who didn't demand emotional performance from them. You became the one person whose presence felt like a sanctuary rather than a burden. They may not have said it, but they valued your peace because your peace made them feel like they didn't have to hide. Your peace made them feel like they could be themselves without consequence. Your peace made them believe that connection didn't have to feel chaotic. And that kind of peace is rare enough that they held on to it even when they were pulling away with their behavior. And ironically, your absence affected them more than your presence ever did. When you were around, they felt safe. When you were gone, they felt the emotional imprint you left behind. They felt the lack of your presence. They felt the quiet shift in their internal world. Avoidants don't always understand emotions in real time. They understand them in the aftermath. And when you were no longer there, they started realizing how deeply connected they were to you. They noticed the silence you used to fill. They remembered your calmness when life became overwhelming. They felt the loss of your emotional stability. They felt the absence of your energy in ways that made them uncomfortable because they weren't used to missing anyone. Missing you wasn't about missing attention. It was about missing the peace you brought into their life. It was about missing the emotional grounding you provided. It was about missing the way their soul felt calmer around yours. Your absence forced them to confront their true feelings, feelings they had been trying to suppress. And that confrontation became the ultimate confirmation that what they felt for you wasn't temporary, casual, or shallow. It was soulful. It was real. It was deeper than anything they told you. Your connection awakened something inside them, something tender, something vulnerable, something they didn't know they were capable of feeling. Their mixed signals, their quiet observations, their subtle shifts, their rare vulnerabilities, all of it was proof. Proof that they loved your soul more than they ever wanted to admit out loud. Proof that you reached them on a level that bypassed every defense they built. Proof that what you shared with them wasn't about attention, it was about connection, resonance, and emotional truth. And even if they never found the perfect words to express it, everything in their behavior showed it. They didn't just care about you. They didn't just admire you. They didn't just feel comfortable with you. They loved you quietly, intensely, and in a way that only a soul can love. When someone reaches your soul instead of your surface, the connection doesn't fade the way ordinary attraction does. It lingers in the quiet parts of your mind, in the subtle memories that return without warning, in the soft echoes of a voice you can't forget. That's what happened to them. Even when they tried to distance themselves, even when they convinced themselves that detaching would protect them, you were still there, woven into their thoughts, their emotions, their internal landscape. They didn't expect that. They didn't want that. Avoidants don't like anything they can't control, especially feelings, but the connection they felt with you wasn't something they could shut down with logic. It lived inside them in ways they never planned for. They would find themselves remembering little things, your voice when you said something meaningful, the way you listened without interrupting, the warmth in your expression when they shared something vulnerable. They remembered your humor, your patience, the softness in your presence. They remembered the small details you probably forgot you ever shared. Those memories came back not because they wanted attention, but because they missed your soul. They missed the emotional clarity you brought into their life. They missed the way your energy felt like home. And the more they remembered, the more something inside them kept awakening. Slowly, quietly, almost against their will, they began to confront what this connection really meant. They started understanding that what they felt for you wasn't just emotional, it was transformative. It challenged their beliefs, it softened their edges, it exposed their fears, but it also healed parts of them they thought would always remain closed. You didn't fix them, you made them feel safe enough to soften themselves. And that safety left a permanent imprint on their heart. What people don't realize is that avoidants feel deeply. They just don't feel safely. And when they finally encounter someone whose soul feels genuine, steady, and accepting, their entire internal world begins to shift. Slowly at first, hesitantly, but undeniably. Little by little, you became the exception they never expected to find. You became the person whose presence changed the way they understood connection. You became the emotional turning point in their life, even if they never said those words out loud. And part of that transformation began with accountability, something avoidants struggle with because accountability requires vulnerability. It requires facing themselves, their patterns, their fears, their emotional limitations. But when they hurt you, when they pulled away, when they acted out of fear instead of love, something inside them shifted. They didn't just feel guilty, they felt responsible. Not responsible for your feelings, but responsible for how their fear affected someone they deeply cared about. And that realization was painful for them, far more painful than they let on. They started seeing the parts of themselves they needed to confront. They started recognizing that the walls they built weren't protecting them, they were harming the connection they valued. They began to understand that avoiding emotions wasn't saving them from pain, it was creating it. And slowly they started becoming more conscious of their patterns. They started wanting to understand themselves better. They started wanting to change, not because you asked them to, but because the connection awakened a desire within them to grow into someone who could meet you more fully. This inner shift wasn't dramatic, it wasn't overnight, it wasn't something they showed publicly. It was a quiet evolution happening behind the scenes, deep inside their heart. They became more aware of their reactions, more thoughtful with their words, more intentional with their presence when they were around you. They began to reflect more deeply, listen more carefully, and consider your emotional world with more sensitivity. They didn't become perfect, they became conscious. And for someone who has lived most of their life emotionally shut down, consciousness is a huge step toward love. But even as they were changing, even as they were becoming more aware, nobody saw the emotional impact you had on them except them. To the outside world, they looked the same, still reserved, still guarded, still slow to open up, but internally, they were shifting in ways that felt monumental. You touched their soul in a way that rewired how they understood love. You taught them that connection didn't have to feel suffocating. You showed them that intimacy didn't have to be a threat. You made vulnerability feel less like exposure and more like trust. And even though they struggled to express it, your presence changed them. You became the person whose memory hit them the hardest in moments of loneliness, not because they craved attention, but because they craved the emotional peace and sincerity you brought into their life. You became the inner voice that calmed their anxiety. You became the emotional truth they returned to when fear convinced them to pull away. You became the standard by which they quietly judged every other connection. They didn't compare you to others consciously, but their heart did. And nothing else felt the same. Nothing else felt as deep. Nothing else felt as genuine. Because what you gave them wasn't attention, it was safety. And what they felt for you wasn't temporary, it was soulful. And the more time passed, the more they realized something they didn't want to admit. No matter who they met, no matter what distractions they found, nobody replaced you. There was no substitute for the emotional depth they felt around you. No one else's presence quieted their nervous system the way yours did. No one else's energy blended with theirs as naturally. No one else's absence echoed as loudly. They could pretend for a while, they could distract themselves, they could retreat into their solitude, but eventually the truth returned. You remained unforgettable. Avoidants don't forget soul connections. They bury them. They distance themselves from them. They pretend they don't feel them. But they don't forget. They can't forget, because the soul doesn't forget what the mind tries to suppress, and that's why they kept coming back. Maybe not always physically, but emotionally, mentally, energetically. Something in them always found its way back to you. And even if the relationship never looked perfect, even if the path was messy, even if there were moments of confusion, the depth was always there. Because this was never a superficial connection. It was never about control, attention, or possession. It was never about ego. It was always about resonance, recognition, soul-level connection. Something ancient, something familiar, something that felt like destiny, even if neither of you ever used that word. And deep inside, they knew it. They knew that the reason you mattered wasn't because you made them feel wanted, it was because you made them feel understood. They knew that their fear wasn't a reflection of your worth, it was a reflection of the intensity of what they felt. They knew that no matter how much they tried to run, something inside them was tied to you. They knew that loving you wasn't something they consciously chose, it was something that happened naturally, quietly, profoundly. And maybe they couldn't express it in the way you deserved. Maybe they didn't communicate their love perfectly. Maybe their fear caused pain. Maybe their distance created confusion. But beneath all the walls, all the hesitation, all the behavior that made you question everything, there was a truth that never changed. They didn't fall in love with your attention. They fell in love with your soul, the part of you that was authentic, the part of you that was gentle, the part of you that was intuitive and kind, the part of you that stayed patient, the part of you that saw them clearly without judgment, the part of you that made their heart feel safe for the first time in years. That is what they loved. That is what they feared losing. That is what kept pulling them back, again and again. And that is the proof, unspoken, subtle, but undeniably real. Because the body doesn't lie. The soul doesn't lie. And genuine connection never disappears. It transforms them. It stays with them. It becomes part of them. Just like you did.